My name is Anna Claire Mercer. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Portland, Oregon, in a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery that smells like butter and burned sugar at 5 a.m. most mornings. For the last 6 years I've worked as a case manager at a non-profit that helps families find stable housing. On paper my life looks like some tidy list of accomplishments. Steady job, an emergency fund I am proud of, a plant I haven't killed yet. But the truth I carry is raw and messy. I'm someone who left her hometown at 18 with a duffel bag and an anger that felt indistinguishable from survival. I'm someone who has not seen my brother Daniel in 7 years. Not really seen him, not in a way that made space for healing. I'm someone who, until last winter, believed some things should stay buried. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. The road back to Shelby, Ohio, felt like traveling through someone else's memory. Snow pressed to the highway shoulders, and the sky was a kind of tight, forced gray that made the roadside trees look brittle. I hadn't meant to come home at Christmas, not this year. I had a plan. Stay away, keep the distance that had kept me alive, and then the phone call happened. Mom's health had collapsed fast, and in the end she left a small, locked shoebox and a note that said, "Give this to Anna when the time is right." No lawyer, no drama. Just that ribboned envelope and a key in the junk drawer of a house I hadn't lived in for years. Shelby smelled like old pies and linoleum, like the winter air when it hits the inside of a house and forgets how to warm. I walked the familiar path to my childhood door with my breath fogging in front of me. The living room still had the same sag in the couch where Mom always sat, knitting something that never turned into much. The entire house seemed to be waiting for a verdict, and so was I. There was an invitation for dinner that said Christmas in curling red ink, an attempt at normalcy. Dan had sent it. Daniel Thomas Mercer, my brother, 3 years older, forever in charge, forever carrying the good son posture like armor. When I walked into the kitchen that night, the light was low, the table set too perfect. China that had been put away for years, candles, a roast that smelled like rosemary, and 1,000 small apologies. Our father's framed portrait sat at the head of the table even though he had been gone for 20 years. An awkward reminder that the past sits at every family meal as a fourth loud, opinionated guest. I thought about the shoebox on my lap like it was a sleeping animal. I had rehearsed what I would say when I saw Dan. "I'm sorry." I wanted to tell him about the places I'd lived, the nights I didn't sleep, the people I had become. Mostly I wanted him to know that I hadn't come to take anything, only to touch the part of us that had been disallowed for too long. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I'm telling you this because the tension at that table didn't come from nowhere. It was stitched by years of small violences, the kind that slowly make houses into cold rooms. Dinner began with the ritual smiles and brittle laughter. Mom's friends sat like jury members, picking at their plates as if the perfect bite might absolve them from witnessing our collapse. The first hour was polite. The second hour was argument waiting for a match. Outside, a wind pushed hard against the windows, and inside, the heat rose like a pressure valve. I watched Dan across the table. He had the same cleft in his chin as when we were kids. He had the same hands, the same way of laughing hard enough that other people's laughter fell in with his. But his eyes were different, hardened around the edges, like someone who'd learned to sharpen himself into a tool to survive. He glanced at the shoebox beside my plate and didn't look away. "We have a history that I can't tell fully without asking you to sit with some heavy things. We were not a functional family. We had been constructed in response to my father's drinking. His promises he never kept, the way his temper turned ordinary rooms into rooms to escape from. Mom did what she could. She made choices that she believed were less terrible than the alternatives. For years, I hated her for those choices. But I'd spent enough nights in a shelter to know that survival and morality are not tidy, and sometimes the lines blur into something unbearably human. That night my heart kept finding strange rhythms, tight bursts, small escapes. My palms had the texture of wax. When you haven't been invited into a space for a long time, your body is the first to register the distance. The quickness of breath, the way your stomach makes itself into a fist. It felt like someone was watching through a window at a stranger sitting at a table, pretending she had always belonged. When you leave a place, you don't only abandon buildings and streets. You leave behind the small economies of knowing. You forget the exact knock of someone, the particular creak in a floorboard, the way a laugh used to end in a whisper. I had been gone long enough that Shelby had become a set I could step into and out of, and yet my feelings were visceral, as if every step had been mapped into me. My childhood was a collage of starts and stops. When I was small, there were times we had money and times we didn't. There were times Dad would read to us in his baritone voice, and other nights when he would drink until the sound of his laughter felt like an accusation. The worst nights were not the ones with yelling. They were the nights of cold quiet when you knew something terrible hung in the air like fog and you couldn't see any exit. Dan found ways to be the good son. Fixed lights, mowed lawns, the one they bragged about at church. I learned to make myself small. I learned that the world rewarded certain sacrifices. Leaving at 18 felt like winning and losing at the same time. I left because I couldn't stand the idea of raising my own children in the same house where the ghost of his anger had the run of the place. I left because staying felt like consenting to a slow erasure of who I might be. But leaving had its own violence. I became the family myth that no one wanted to explain. The prodigal, the traitor, the girl who chose herself. People in Shelby made up versions of my story that suited them. I became a ghost they'd conjure when they wanted to make someone else feel better about compromises. Dan's life stayed tethered to Shelby in a way mine never did. He married, had a couple of jobs, bought a truck with more chrome than sense. He married again and again in ways that suggested he believed permanence could be engineered with furniture and promises. He stuck to the things our parents told us were solid. Pay your taxes, go to church, fix the fence. He was the one who remained to be the household's moral thermometer, and in being the thermometer he kept the rest of us measured and judged. The shoebox had a smell that was instantly recognizable. Dust, lavender, the faint grease of a life lived thriftily. I had found it at the back of an attic trunk when I'd been clearing out Mom's things, the note pinned to the lid with handwriting that was shakier than I'd ever seen. Inside were a handful of letters folded carefully, the edges browned like autumn leaves. There was a photograph of us as kids, two shadowy children on a porch, winter coats too big for them, and a small, thin envelope with the word Dan written in Mom's hand. There are relationships that keep score, and ours had become ledger-keeping in the worst way. Every perceived slight was logged, every absence labeled treachery. I kept waiting for someone to admit the ledger was a lie. To be fair, I wasn't blameless. I left without explanations, and that hurts people. But absence begets narratives. When you are not around to tell your own story, the story told about you becomes the truth they share at the next church potluck. At night in the guest room I couldn't sleep. My chest would tighten as if a hand were clasped around it. The room smelled like lavender and old books. I lay there and went over and over the conversations I had rehearsed in my head. The way Dan and I had once built a small fort of blankets and whispered secrets that felt like currency. I missed that currency. I missed the softness we once had before the world taught us to defend ourselves. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people, I said once in a voice message to myself. Silly perhaps, but that phrase is how I try to remind myself I'm not the only one sitting with this. The truth is, stories like ours are not unique. And sometimes the permission to feel hurts comes from hearing a voice that sounds like your own. We met in the kitchen some hours before dinner. Dan was standing by the stove, hands deep in dishwater, jaw clenched in a way that told me he had rehearsed what he would say. His voice was calm but thin. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "I needed to see Mom," I replied, because it was true. I needed to know she didn't die thinking I was gone without goodbye. "You left," he said, and the accusation was small, precise. "You left when we needed you." "Dan, I was a kid trying to survive," I said. "What were you trying to do?" He sloshed the water and didn't meet my eyes. "I held this place together. I kept things from falling apart. You walking away made things harder. People make sacrifices." "I have sacrifices," I said. "I have nights I barely slept working so families didn't lose their homes. I have scars that don't show up on a hospital chart. I didn't leave because it was easy. I left because staying felt like dying a little at a time. There was a fatigue in him like a tight band. There was a guilt that toggled between being anonymous and boiling over into anger. When families are fragile, people tend to point fingers to avoid the more painful work of being seen. The kitchen fan hummed, the house settled, and the moment felt like a held breath. We had both brought weapons. Mine was truth, his was righteous hurt. Neither was enough on their own. Dinner had the ceremonial rhythm of a play. We laughed at rehearsed jokes. We ate the rolls we were expected to chew. Then, like a small but significant gust, Mom's old friend Ruth asked the kind of question that opens a wound. "Anna, what is it you wanted to talk about tonight?" She didn't mean to wound. She was an old woman who forgot that some curiosities become knives. Dan's smile thinned. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "We weren't expecting this," he said to me in front of the group. The air shifted into a sharper pitch. The room felt like a balloon about to pop. People stared in the way people stare when something not entirely public is about to become public. I felt my cheeks go hot. My hands were the kind of clammy that makes you worry about your grip on reality. "You don't belong here," Dan said it then, short like a verdict. He didn't shout. He delivered it like a jury reading a sentence. Silence landed like a physical thing. For a split second I thought maybe someone would laugh and call it a joke. But there was no laugh. There were only mouths that had been trained to close. "You don't belong here," he repeated, voice steadier now. "You made a choice to leave. You made a choice to abandon us. This is our life and you don't get to come in and, the hell with it." Heat rose in my chest and then, more terrifyingly, a cold that slipped under my ribs. My first instinct was to disappear, to gather the parts of me that were still whole and run. Instead, my fingers curled around the shoebox on the table as if its cardboard were a lifeline. The box felt heavier than it looked. I could hear my heartbeat in my throat. "Dan," I said, my voice thinner than I wanted. "Please. Please let me at least tell you." "Tell me what?" He jabbed a fork into the roast. "Tell me the story we've all heard 100 times that makes you the martyr. Tell me you're sorry for making everything harder." My throat closed. The room smelled suddenly like gravy and antiseptic, and that peculiar ozone taste before a storm. My hands worked like they had minds of their own and flipped the lid off the shoebox. Inside were the letters, folded like small secrets. The top letter had Mom's handwriting. Messy, the S's looping like hands that had knotted and unknot in equal measure. There was a small, brittle photograph tucked between them. It was Dad and Mom on a summer day, young and unlined in a picture of backyard silliness, and on the back Mom had written in a hand that trembled even in the memory, "For Anna when she is ready." I slid the top letter free. My voice shook as I read aloud, because the table seemed suddenly too close and too far all at once. "Anna, if you are reading this at a table with people who think they have the right to your story, I want you to know I never stopped choosing you. The choices I made were not perfect. They were ugly. I have loved you like a fierce animal across years that were sometimes too hungry to be wise. I left because there were times I believed my staying would cost you more than I could bear to give. I am sorry for the ways my absence has been paid for with silence. Please forgive me for what you had to survive because of me. I failed, and I also did the best I could with the hand I had. If you ever doubt you belong in this house, please remember my hands opened it for you more than anyone's ever did." The room held that apology like a thing that could either heal or explode. It was the kind of candid confession that changes atmospheres. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the low tick of the oven. Dan laughed, an ugly, hollow sound. "Convenient," he said. "She dies and suddenly there's a letter. What is this, some kind of dramatic last-minute script?" My hands moved to another letter. My throat felt raw as I read the next one. It explained things that our town had not been taught to name. The way Dad's anger was a force that manipulated the people around him, how he pushed everyone into roles, how Mom had left sometimes to keep us safe from the escalation. There were details that stung. Admissions that Mom had been scared, that she had taken temporary work away from the house and sometimes left us with neighbors while she worked the graveyard shift. There were apologies I had wanted to hear for years. Dan's face changed in ways that were almost painful to watch. First indignation, then denial, then something like grief that he clearly wasn't ready to name. Some old ghost had been set loose and was walking back through his chest. "This is not my fault," he said suddenly, not to me but to the room. I had to keep things together. "You would have left too if things were as dark as she describes," I said softly. "You didn't, and that's something you should be proud of. But that doesn't make your anger at me a fair thing." He stared at me, and I could see his eyes trying to reconcile the Dan who'd been taught to protect and the Dan who had been taught to blame. People at the table shifted. Ruth dabbed her eyes. The roast sat untouched as the letter's honesty emptied the room of the small talk that had kept it steady. If this is resonating with you, share the story. Sometimes these are the voices that need to be heard. I had prepared myself for everything that night. For his anger, for his rejection, for the quiet. But I hadn't prepared for the strange relief that came with the letter's existence. The truth wasn't tidy, but it was oxygen. After the letter reading, the room felt suspended. Dan's hand, which had been white-knuckled around his fork, loosened. He set it down as if deciding whether to pick up a weapon or a pillow. The flicker of firelight from the candles turned his features into something softer, as if exposure to the truth had worn down the edges he'd sharpened for so long. "You could have told me," he finally whispered. It wasn't so much a question as a plea. "You could have told me some of it." We could have, I echoed, and the unfinished sentence hung like smoke. My body had a strange, almost electric lightness after the initial blow. Part of me had expected more. An argument, an accusation, bitter words to make me smaller in the room. Instead there was a complicated, aching unspooling. Mom's letters had done something that anger couldn't. They had created a new space for conversation, messy and honest and dangerous in a way that could either destroy us or start to build. Dan stood abruptly and walked to the window, his breath fogging a small circle on the glass. Outside, snow collected on the sill and made little caps that glowed like soft paper. He seemed smaller there, a silhouette trying not to think in absolutes. "I thought you had left because you hated us," he said, not turning. "I thought you wanted to be free of this place. Maybe you did. I thought you made a choice to abandon me, no matter the reasons. And I was angry. I thought maybe you didn't love us the way you should." "I did love you," I said. "I just loved myself enough to leave. That doesn't make me less of a sister." He laughed once, a sound that belonged to a person half known. "You always were so stubborn," he said. "I thought I was the stubborn one. I thought I was the only one who carried the house." "You carried it so it could carry us," I said. "You couldn't have known everything Mom had to do. None of us could." The rain of words didn't stop the ache that had lived for years. But it moved it into a place where it could be handled, like putting a fragile object into a padded box. We didn't resolve everything that night. We only opened the box and saw the pieces. After Dan and I spoke, others at the table lost the last of their theatrical politeness. People exchanged stories. Small admissions, apologies that were clumsy and earnest. Ruth told a story about Mom sneaking out in the middle of the night to bring a sleeping bag and a casserole to a neighbor down the street. How she had put the needs of a stranger ahead of her own comfort. The stories didn't fix the past. They simply illuminated it, complicated it. Everyone had their part. Everyone had their sins and sacrifices. And for the first time in years we all fit into a shape that wasn't purely finger-pointing. Later, after the plates were cleared, Dan and I sat on the stoop with a shoebox between us. The cold night bit at our cheeks. Our breaths made ghosted conversations in the air. "I'm sorry I said you didn't belong," he said, abrupt and sudden. "That was cruel." "You're allowed to be angry," I said. "You have every right. I don't want your forgiveness to be a bandage." "I know," he said. "I don't want it to be either. I want to figure out why I feel so hollow when you show up." "Then let's figure it out," I said. Not tonight, maybe. But we can try. If nothing else, Mom wanted us to be in the same room, and maybe we owe her that. He laughed short and honest. Don't make me cry in front of Ruth's casserole, he muttered. Too late, I said. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. I said it aloud to the empty night, half joking, half pleading. Telling stories has a way of knitting divided things back together, and I wanted that selfishly with all my chest. In the months that followed, nothing changed overnight. The house still creaked. The holiday ornaments still hung a little crooked. A lot of things we couldn't repair with apologies alone. Therapy didn't fix scars that had been put there by years of adaptive survival. But there were small, incremental motions of repair that felt sacred precisely because they were tiny. A phone call that wasn't a logistical transaction. A Sunday where Dan showed up unannounced with coffee. A letter where I admitted my own fault without the balm of defense. The shoebox lived on a shelf at Mom's old house. Its ribbon faded but intact, like a bookmark marking the place where our story had been interrupted and then resumed. One afternoon over the summer, Dan and I walked the old path behind our childhood house, the trail that cut through the scrub where we used to play school as kids. The air smelled like cut grass and something green and vehement. We talked about practical things, Dad's model trucks, the estate cleanup, and then about smaller, harder things. He told me about nights he'd sat on the porch and cried without understanding why. I told him about the nights I counted bus routes and tried to plan a life that didn't have a furnace's hum right behind it. I've been so afraid of not belonging, he said suddenly. Not in the town but in my own family. I saw you walk away and I thought, you left me to hold a house that was falling apart. I thought your leaving made me less than. I thought I deserved an apology. You do deserve to, I said. And I deserve to be seen, not because I left but because I tried to survive. We both cried then, quietly, in a way that didn't feel like surrender but like cleaning out a room. The tears were small admissions that our family had been imperfect but not irredeemable. The letters in the shoebox had not been a magic fix. They were, however, a key to conversation, a permission slip to name things that had been nameless for too long. If something like this has ever happened to you, feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. Bringing your stories into the light is hard and necessary work. For me, the lesson is simple and stubborn. Belonging is not a prize reserved for the perfect. It is a messy, ongoing negotiation that requires courage to both leave and return. Years later, when people ask me whether Christmas changed everything, I tell them the truth. No, it didn't. But it started something. It started the deliberate, awkward process of learning to sit in the same room without needing to assign blame in order to be safe. It started the possibility that we could remember Mom without pretending everything had been lovely. It started a new vocabulary. Of apologies, of boundaries, of the small acts of kindness that stitch people back together. We still have arguments. We still fall into old defenses. There are days Dan and I don't speak for weeks. But then one of us will call about nothing of consequence. And we'll both know it's an offering. The shoebox sits in my trunk the next time I come home. A little battered, a little dignified. And when I look at it, I'm not thinking about who owned the house or who deserves what. I'm thinking about the fact that someone had the bravery to fold those letters and tuck them away. That Mom had the wisdom to know when words might heal even if she couldn't say them herself. The lesson I carry, and the one I hope this story gives you, is that the truth, when shared, has the power to change the shape of a home. It doesn't erase the past, but it can make room for something like forgiveness. Not a fairy tale forgiveness that fixes everything, but a real, honest truce that allows two people who once felt like strangers in the same house to sit, eat, and exist in the same space again. We learned how to belong to each other not by default but by decision. That, more than anything, felt like coming home.